Hello everyone, I'm Captain Logan and welcome back to the derivative and edgy Comic Vault. Today, we're going to take a look at a miniseries Marvel published in 2006 called Spider-Man Reign. This is a really odd piece, a 4-issue miniseries that I had heard of but had never read. I remember these covers. I probably own a couple issues of this and just never took a look at it. And it turns out that it is basically an attempt at doing The Dark Knight Returns with Spider-Man. And we'll talk about whether or not it succeeds at that and all the different ways in which it is very derivative of Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, but also it reminds me a lot of Watchmen in places, too, so we'll talk about all of that. This was requested by TheDayGhost, who said that this was a bizarre oddity, and he was curious to know what I thought of it. And like I said, this is my first time sitting down and reading this, and I had heard, the only thing I'd really heard about this is it is strange and is maybe worth avoiding. I didn't hate this. I'm kind of glad I read it, just because it is a real different take on Spider-Man. It's definitely a way of experiencing this character that I had never had before, but it's material that doesn't work as well with Spider-Man that it did with Batman, and I think maybe it could have, but the flavor of it is kind of all wrong. So let's go ahead and get into it, shall we? This was written and drawn by Kare Andrews. I'm not sure how you pronounce his first name, and he is a Canadian artist and sometimes writer who was doing a lot of stuff for Marvel in the early 2000s, and a guy who I did not remember or had not heard of before looking at this. He apparently did a lot of kind of fill-in issues for the various series in the early 2000s, including some X-Men stuff, and he did a lot of covers, and he occasionally wrote and drew his own issues, I think, again, mostly fill-in stuff and maybe some one-shots, and as far as I'm aware, this is the longest thing he ever did by himself. These, like Dark Knight Returns, are oversized issues, and it's not as long as Dark Knight Returns, I don't think, or maybe it ends up getting close to that page count, but it's 4 books, and each of them is, and I don't think they're all the same length either. They're somewhere between 35 and 45 pages each of them. I think the last one is the longest one. It's like 44, 45 pages. And the premise is we're in Peter Parker's future, but what looks like basically present day, so it's kind of like Dark Knight Returns, where it's a stylized present that is in some ways maybe like slightly futuristic, but not really. It's like really ambiguous about the time period, but like technology-wise, it more or less looks like the world you live in, so it's like all of Spidey's early adventures would have taken place in the 60s or the 70s, and it has been decades since he put on the costume. He's an old man now. The book's also really ambiguous about how old he is, which kind of becomes an issue when you compare him to some other characters that we meet from his past that seem not as old as he is, but are definitely older because of how old they were when he was younger. But I'm getting ahead of myself. He lives in a world where masks have been outlawed, just like in Watchmen. That's the biggest way in which it reminds me of that. And you have a city with New York that is thought of as almost a utopia now, where like crime is kind of gone now, but it's a police state, it's a totalitarian state. The mayor can pretty much do whatever he wants to. He suspends habeas corpus constantly. He's made it so that conveniently he gets to stay the mayor, and he's gotten rid of elections. He says temporarily, but of course it's probably forever. That also reminds me of Watchmen, because Nixon is a little bit that way in that book, and everybody is kind of pretending like it's still a free country, or like New York exists within the free country. It's hard to say what exactly the rest of the United States is like in this book, because we don't go anywhere else. We don't really talk about any other cities or anywhere else in the country, but it's said that this mayor, Waters, who I don't think is any character that we've met before. I think he's a new character. Waters is talking about how he wants to take his brand of government to the rest of the country because it's worked so well here, where we don't have vigilante violence anymore. So, like, just simply getting rid of masks got rid of crime, or at least that's what we're pretending like happened. And throughout most of the book, we think that he's the man on top, and then it turns out that there's somebody that we do know that actually is over him, and I'll talk talk about that in a minute. By the way, I am going to spoil this whole thing. I usually like to use the Comic Vault to let you guys know what happens in a book as much as also reviewing the book in case you never get around to reading it. So big spoiler alert with this. I'm going to give away all the major developments in this book. But anyway, so Peter Parker is down on his luck, as always, but he's also kind of senile and maybe even suffering from dementia. He's definitely having hallucinations. We think that Mary Jane is in the apartment with him through a lot of the book, or at least we're supposed to think that. I was skeptical of it from the beginning and turned out to be right about it, where she just keeps standing at the window or sitting in a chair at dinner not saying anything, and Peter's having a really hard time keeping his patience and not freaking out on her, and occasionally he'll just start yelling at her and then apologizes, and you're like, what exactly is going on here? He gets fired at the beginning from a job where he's just like bringing flowers to weddings, and he screws that up somehow, where like it's supposed to be white flowers, but he brings the wrong color, where it's like off-white or something, and he gets fired. And so he goes home, and he's got no money, and he already barely had any money to begin with, and his bones and joints are in bad shape, presumably from years of fighting crime, and he's just having a real hard time, and his brain's not right. It's just, this Peter Parker is kind of out to lunch. He's basically done. And he, like I said, keeps having these hallucinations of Mary Jane. Later on, we'll find out that she's dead, and that he spiraled out of control like this and became such a bent and broken man because he blames himself for her death, of course. And we discover, and this is the big thing that this book gets made fun of a lot for, and that was kind of the big controversial thing, apparently, with this book. Mary Jane dies, and I'm going to say ostensibly, because this is what Peter tells us, but he strikes me as an unreliable narrator throughout. So I guess this is probably what actually happened, but I don't trust anything he's, like, just while I'm reading the book, I don't trust anything he's ever saying, so I guess it technically could have been something else. She gets cancer, and Peter assumes that, because it's not like he would get a diagnosis from a doctor because nobody knows he's Spider-Man, right? So that's why I'm taking it somewhat with a grain of salt, but I think this is what the book is wanting us to think it is too, that basically, and I'm going to be as delicate with this and be as not crass as possible on my family-friendly YouTube channel, but basically, their married couple intimate relations led to her getting cancer because Peter Parker has not only radioactive blood, but radioactive every other kind of fluid. And so Mary Jane got cancer and died. And as she's on her deathbed, she is having a difficult time speaking and keeps saying go, and he takes that to mean that she hates him and doesn't want to see him anymore and blames him for her dying, and so he goes off and gets ultra depressed and stops being Spider-Man and has a miserable existence. And we find out later that she was actually trying to say, go get him, Tiger. And so it turns out that she didn't blame him, and I mean, how could she really? Like, it's a real, like specific and unique situation to them. Most people aren't going to get married to somebody with radioactive blood, and the only way you could blame your spouse for giving you cancer in that situation would be to say, you never should have married me in the first place, right? So this is a really melodramatic piece. It is, and I don't think the melodrama works most of the time, but I'll give you some more synopsis before I start breaking down some of my, feelings and thoughts about this book. So, that ends up happening. This is where it gets really weird, because reanimated corpse-looking Doc Octopus, I don't know where he came from. I don't know if he's actually dead and came from the underworld like he sort of talks about. I don't know what's going on in that scene, but there's a skeleton-looking Dr. Octopus that starts pulling people from Peter Parker's life out of their graves, people who have died. One of them is Mary Jane, and when her dead corpse comes out of the grave, she tells Peter Parker about the Go Get 'em Tiger thing, and that it wasn't really his fault, or that she doesn't blame him for her death. and that's where the book really kind of loses me. I don't know if that's literally supposed to be a dead person talking, or if that's Peter, if like Peter's mind is just starting to like tell him what really happened and like fitting things together, but through his hallucinations, because the book never really tells you when it's a hallucination and when it's not. You have to kind of figure that out for yourself, and most of the time it's pretty clear. I'm not saying that it's too cryptic about that, but in that scene it kind of is, especially because I don't really understand that Dr. Octopus. So I don't know if I missed something or what, but I combed through this a couple of times and I don't know what's going on in that scene. It's very strange. Meanwhile, you've got the mayor, who is putting together a plan to put a big electrified web, because of course it's a web. There's a lot of real cutesy Spider-Man stuff in this. Like, that's got to be a web, and there's a guy that Peter Parker fights toward the beginning in an alleyway doesn't fight, is like trying to help and actually doesn't manage to succeed at that, because like he's old and geriatric and his heart's not in it. But there's this guy who's getting beaten up by the police, like the totalitarian police state at the beginning, the Rain. And he calls himself Ben, and his name isn't really Ben. He's making up a silly name to be mean to the police, to kind of troll them. So it's like Ben Dover and something. And I don't know. It's really odd writing. It's really strange writing. And even with him just making that up, it's still a little bit too coincidental that we put Peter in a similar situation, sort of, to what happened when Ben got killed, where it's like there's this person that's there's like an injustice that's happening that you could stop, maybe, and if you don't, the consequences are worse than if you do. And then that guy calls himself Ben, and like I knew we were in trouble from that very moment, where I was like, okay, it's gonna be one of these stories. It's gonna get really kind of cutesy and sappy on us. It definitely goes to those places all throughout. The mayor's gonna put this electric web around the city under the pretense of protecting the city. Well, I say pretense. He actually thinks that's what he's doing. This guy believes in the power and responsibility thing, but he takes it way too far. So he's supposed to be a foil for Spider-Man, because he thinks that the more power you have, the more responsibility you have to take care of everyone at any cost. And so he keeps saying this. I guess the pretense is freedom, right? It's that whole thing, and we've seen this 1,000 times, especially in a lot of movies since this came out. A lot of the ideas that some of the earlier Marvel movies are dealing with are in this, particularly Winter Soldier and Age of Ultron and Civil War, where it's freedom versus security, where this guy says freedom, there is a high price to pay for freedom, but in fact the high price to pay is freedom for security. And so he's going to put this big web up, and nobody can leave and nobody can come in. And so it is the ultimate protection, in that he's managed to stop most crime because he outlawed superheroes and supervillains. And now he's going to make it so that nobody can get in, and it's going to be like the armor around the world idea that Iron Man has in Age of Ultron, right? And again, he's pretending like that gives people freedom. It's kind of that 1984 doublespeak thing, where in fact he's asking everyone to lose their freedom in order to be protected. And like, he's really misguided, but his heart is kind of in the right place, where he actually thinks that he's helping people. He actually thinks that he's doing sort of what Spider-Man always should have done, though he doesn't necessarily put it in those terms. But it turns out that he's got kind of a benefactor. He's got somebody that is lording over him, that is telling him what to do, and he thinks that this is for the good of everyone, but in fact it's really just so that Venom can eat people. The actual mind behind all of this is the Venom symbiote, which seems to be working now without any host. And it talks about Eddie Brock and how it used to be a part of him, but now he's just this lonely symbiote. And he keeps talking about how lonely he is. And Venom wants this to happen so that he can feed and not be lonely, and also to kind of get revenge on Spider-Man for abandoning him, I guess. And that's where what social satire is here kind of breaks down. It does the Dark Knight Returns thing of having talking heads on television saying really scary things and acting like everything is really kosher and great and like you have a utopia. And, of course, they're being told what to say by this Waters guy, who at the beginning, by the way, reads like he's a lot more malicious than he actually is. He's a totally different character in the first issue than he is through the rest of it. It's very strange. If you've read this, tell me if you know what's going on in this scene, because I've read it twice and I don't get it. There's this character that he's had in prison, or like his own, like, I don't even know where this guy is, like they just threw him in a hole for 10 years, and he is, like, really deformed and falling apart, and every year Waters brings this guy back out and sits him in front of him while he has a nice steak dinner and then throws him back in the hole. And I don't know who that guy is supposed to be, but because masks have been outlawed for 10 years, I'm going to assume that he's a superhero or a supervillain, and that he's supposed to, like, personify the old world that Waters has solved, that he's fixed. I don't really know who that guy was supposed to be because he's not named, or at least I didn't see a name. I looked at this a couple of times. But anyways, I don't know what's going on in that scene, but he feels really malicious. And I mean, I guess he's the same character in the sense that if the idea is supposed to be that he is the personification of everything that he fixed, then he still thinks that he's doing the best he can for the people of the city, but he just seemed to be really enjoying it there in a way that he doesn't later. And then, of course, we do the whole thing by issue 4 where he realizes that he's really screwed up and he just tries to run away. And so you've got the social satire about apathetic, you know, people on the ground who are fine with a oppressive state as long as they're protected and as long as they have everything they think they need, and so people just end up being lemmings, and they're not really concerned about freedom as long as they can kind of like pretend like they still have it. And I think that all starts to break down a little bit once it turns out that Venom is in charge of everything, where, like, I get the kind of literal metaphor of that, where it's like, if you don't fight for your own freedom, you'll get eaten. And like, that's literally what happens, where it's like, you will be consumed by the oppressive government or culture that's doing that to you. And so he's like a literal embodiment of the consequences of that, I guess, but it's not as interesting, I don't think, as if Waters was just working on his own, and I think you could have made him somebody. I think he could have been a Green Goblin, I think he could have been a Kingpin, or even if the person over Waters was somebody that we knew already that had, like, a really interesting ideology and, like, believed in what he was preaching, as opposed to just, like, a monster that creates this state in order to get fed and get what he wants. Like, it's just not as connected to the bigger, like, social ideas and ramifications, and kind of just gives you a really easy out at the end, where, okay, so all you actually have to do is fight and beat this big monster guy, and then everything's okay. I mean, everything's not okay. Like, when you get to the end of this, because we got rid of the government that was in charge, you no longer have the kind of utopia that you had, and so it's, so again, kind of the Watchmen idea, where, except that at the end of Watchmen, it's ambiguous as to whether or not the utopia, you know, Veidt's utopia is going to stick around. In this, it's, okay, we've definitely torn it down, and Jameson, who I've not talked about at all yet, has this big speech at the end where he goes on TV and he says, okay, the masks are back, and everybody's, you know, there's crime again, and there's panic in the streets, but isn't it wonderful because we have our freedom now? And I guess it's up to the reader to decide what the trade-off is. You know, what's better than the other. But the piece is certainly saying that it's better to have crime and to have violence and to let people and to try to, like, change people's hearts and minds, like, within a moral code, than to try to again, like Veidt does in Watchmen, kind of force reality to coalesce to your will, and that's always going to break down at some point, and that you can't ever stop bad people from doing bad things. Like, that's always going to be there, and the best you can, and like, it's not worth losing people's freedom in order to give people security, is kind of the idea of the book. That all works okay to me on paper. Like by the end, you know, what the book's about is fine. I've seen it 100 times in other things, but it's fine. The biggest idea in this that's really interesting to me is and this is the Waters thing, is the idea that not only is it that with great power comes great responsibility, but the inverse is also true. If you are given responsibility, that in turn gives you power. So those things are almost the same thing, like they're almost synonymous. And so if you give up your responsibility, you also give up your power. And that's an idea that permeates through the book that I actually think is kind of interesting, and I've not seen talked about exactly the way it is here. So that's my biggest like positive takeaway from the book, is that thematically is an interesting idea. So the way Jameson is used in this is he's basically your, like, doomsayer. He's kind of Rorschach, really. He's like your you know, crotchety old man on the street, like, holding a sign saying the world is doomed. He's the preacher that is standing around telling everybody that things are horrible and have to change, and that everything is falling apart, and if we don't do something, we're in trouble. And of course, he's right about it. So he looks like a delusional old man, like Spider-Man actually is, and it turns out that he isn't actually, but what's done with him is really kind of strange. So he ends up basically leading, like, an underground movement of kids to try to stop the big electric web from being put up, and this is very silly. So we're told that, like, crosses and bells and things of that nature are all being taken away because somehow that's supposed to, like, mess with the electric web network. And at first it looks like it's an excuse to try to get rid of, like, religion, and to try to get rid of freedom of thought and freedom of speech, because we already know from the second issue that a lot of literature has been banned, and Jameson is trying to put out a newspaper to tell everybody that Spider-Man is back, and he gets in trouble for doing that, and all of his papers are burned and destroyed. And so we know that there's a lot of, like, curbing of freedom of speech and stuff. But it turns out that the real reason that all of the religious relics are being banned is because bells create sounds that hurt Venom. That's the reason that we're trying to get rid of that. And so at the end, so Jameson has his suspicions for whatever reason. I don't really know how he figured this out, but Jameson has his suspicion that Venom is behind everything. And so he wants to make sure that the church bells don't all go away. And he makes sure that at the church where he's preaching at, where he's not actually preaching anything about the Bible or any religion, he's just preaching that this utopia is actually a dystopia, and we have to fight the system. It's just that kind of character. He retains a church bell, and then at the end, that's the big thing that helps to defeat the Venom monsters. By the way, I don't know why there are so many Venom monsters. There's Venom, but then he's got like 100 other symbiote-looking monsters that he needs to feed. That are, I don't know where they came from. I don't know what they're about. I, again, read it twice. I have no idea what's going on with that. It seems like we just needed an army of monsters to fight, and so they're there, no explanation. And the bell is used to fight them, but it's also used to get Spider-Man to get off his duff and decide to keep being Spider-Man and not to literally bury himself in a grave and give up. He is so Al Simmons through a lot of this. And then he hears a bell, and then he's annoyed by a bell, and then he gets out of the casket that he's buried himself in because he's decided to maybe commit suicide, I think. And then conveniently in the casket where he buries himself is the red and blue Spider-Man suit. And he puts that on, and you have a literal resurrection of Spider-Man, and then he goes and fights Venom, and then he decides to be responsible again and fight for the memory of Mary Jane. And so it's supposed to be a positive ending because geriatric Spider-Man is going to keep being Spider-Man. Yeah, I mean, the more I talk about it, the odder it is in my head, and the more it kind of breaks down. But yeah, so, and I'm all over the place, but the other really, really funny thing about Venom is there's foreshadowing that Venom is actually behind everything, because Water is at one point in his building, because of course, they build like this big tower that I think they call Olympus or something. Everything is so on the nose in this. They've got this big tower where he lords over everyone like a god, and then Venom later calls himself a god. He sees himself that way, whereas God, he sees himself that way. He gets in an elevator, and Venom is on floor V. Or he goes to floor V, and then later we find out that Venom is there. So that's the big foreshadowing for Venom, is that there's a floor, and it's floor V. Yeah, so Peter Parker keeps throughout this insisting on not wanting to be Spider-Man anymore and not wanting to live his life at all, and he's basically just on the edge and ready to kill himself. And he's kind of unsympathetic all through this, but also he's not all there either, so it's hard to really get a great peg on him and to really appreciate him as the protagonist of this piece. Like, at the very end, when he's going to go on and start taking responsibility again, because there's this whole thing, and this is also a motif that I like. There's a thematic idea that I like. There's this whole thing about how dying or death is not scary, giving up is scary. So it is even worse in Peter's head to totally give up on everything he cares about and give up on the world than it is to commit suicide. And so that's why ultimately he decides to take his licks and start trying to be responsible again, damn the consequences. Although, the opportunity for change is weird, because, again, all throughout this, he's just, not wanting to do anything, and he kind of just buries his head in the sand. Not literally, because Sandman is in this, and he doesn't bury his head in Sandman. And Sandman has something to do with actually kind of getting him off his duff and getting him to start being proactive. But the thing that makes him put on the red and blue costume toward the end, again, is just, I'm lying in a grave, I've decided I'm gonna die. Unless the idea was always he's not actually going to commit suicide, he's not actually just going to lay there and die. He was always planning on putting on the red and blue suit and jumping out of that, but I don't think so. The way it plays, he's laying there, and he's got tears coming from his eyes, and the internal monologue is I'm ready to lay here and die, basically. I'm pretty sure that's what he's going to do. And then it's just, that damn bell is ringing, and it's so annoying. Who's ringing that bell? Get off my lawn! And then he just gets out of the grave, and then he goes off, and he gets out of his grave, and then he just stands on a roof, and he starts singing the SpiderMan theme, like the 60s cartoon Spider-Man. He's like, here comes the Spider-Man! And then he runs off, and he hasn't really had an opportunity for change, because it's just, besides just, okay, I guess Mary Jane didn't hate me, but he already knows that when he's gonna lay down and die. It's like, oh, I guess this bell is ringing, something's going on, I guess the world needs me now. But it's after that he has the big epiphany about, about it being scarier to give up than it is to die. And then he goes, or he's already being proactive at that point, and now he has that epiphany. It's almost a weird double beat, except there wasn't anything specifically except I'm being annoyed right now that got him out of the casket in the first place. So, I don't know, his character arc is really odd. And you know what, let me backtrack for a second, because I didn't mention how Jameson and Spider-Man get involved in all this. He's looking for Peter, and he finally finds him, and he brings him the mask. He brings him the black Spider-Man mask wrapped around a camera, and Peter puts it on, and then he ends up having to, fight some, yahoos outside, but he doesn't plan on continuing after that, and he just punches out Jameson because he's mad at him for coming and finding him, and just for all the, horrible things he's done to him in the past. There's also this whole thing about Spider-Man turning Jameson into a liar, where, like, he blames Peter Parker for the kind of newspaper he was running, where he was like, I was about the truth. And, of course, you can say unreliable narrator, you can say that he's lying, you can say that he's got a skewed perspective. I'm not sure what the book is actually saying about this, because Jameson goes, I was a newsman. He keeps saying that. I was a newspaper man, and I was all about truth. And you kept feeding me lies, and you let me hate you. And I wouldn't have hated you if I'd known that Peter Parker was Spider-Man and what you were actually trying to accomplish. And you turned me into a liar. And I've always wondered about the ethical implications of the way Peter Parker keeps his secret identity and the, like, old school classic Spider-Man, where he pretends like Spider-Man is someone else, and he basically takes pictures of himself and takes advantage of that situation in order to make money. I've never been able to, and I've talked about this before, fully square that with his principles of responsibility. But the idea that he turned Jameson into a liar strikes me as ridiculous. And I don't know if the book is really saying that, or if that's just Jameson's spin, right? But anyway, so Jameson throughout the book is trying to get Spider-Man to be proactive by forcing him into situations. So he tells everybody where Peter lives. Peter has to leave his home, and he tells, like he basically says all the things he used to say about Spider-Man, trying to get Spider-Man to have to get back into the limelight, even though he doesn't believe the things he's saying. So, like, he calls Spider-Man a menace, but he doesn't really mean that. He's just trying to make him public again so that he'll get out and do something about Mayor Waters. And I don't know, that dynamic is kind of interesting. I guess I don't totally mind how Jameson is used in this, except for the whole you turned me into a liar thing. That's all really odd. I talked to Eric about this a little bit. He had read this, and he said he thought that it was just kind of a ripoff of DArnot Returns, and that it was, at the end of the day, pretty mean-spirited, and I agree with that for the most part. I like idea-wise where it gets by the end, but I don't know how well it earns that, and a lot of it does feel like it's just trying to be edgy and do like really adult stuff with Spider-Man that you wouldn't usually do. It's trying to be like a really rough and tumble cynical piece. And whenever Peter Parker is in the Spider-Man suit, it's trying to prove that it gets what Spider-Man is, so he's really quippy, and he does a lot of jokes, and I kind of like that they're kind of old man jokes. I think that's kind of fun. He's almost got like this dad joke thing, or this like grandpa joke thing, because he's like elderly geriatric Spider-Man now, and I think that's kind of fun. But it is kind of like tonally uneven, where that's happening while he's still really senile and seems to have dementia, and again, by the end, I still never know if I'm looking at a sane human being or not. Like, are the do all of the hallucinations just conveniently go away because he's talked to the corpse or the ghost or whatever of Mary Jane? And again, was that real, or was that all in his head, or like what's happening? So it's trying really hard to be a dark Spider-Man story without making Spider-Man dark, except it makes Spider-Man dark, except for the scenes where he's not. So that's kind of problematic. Like, again, on paper, thematically, it understands everything that Spider-Man's about. But just because it's a story about power and responsibility, and just because it has an interesting new kind of take and angle on that, doesn't make it a great Spider-Man story, because I don't like Spider-Man, and I just don't find myself sympathizing with him the way I'm supposed to about how far gone he's gotten, because I don't fully understand even, like, how crazy he is. And I get kind of how he got that way, but I also don't entirely buy it. I don't totally buy that that he would, again, like, hear Mary Jane say go, and then she dies, and then his whole world falls apart. Like, that's how far he trusts her? Really? Like, he really thinks that she blames him for her death just because his blood and bodily fluids were radioactive? Really? Like, I don't really buy that, so I didn't find him especially sympathetic. We've got the Sinister Six in this. They're called the Sinister Six. which is silly, and again ends up being really on the nose, where like they're sent out by the gods, the you know, people that are pretending to be gods and lording over everyone, and so they take like the worst of the sinners and they basically make them the Suicide Squad. They put bombs in them, and if they you know, trail off and they're, you know, not doing what they're supposed to, the bombs will get activated and they're gonna die. And so Waters is like Amanda Waller, it's like Amanda Waters, and it's, I think, pretty much the traditional Sinister Six. And Sandman is there, and like I said, his daughter is the girl that's kind of running the underground in this, and she kind of sets him straight at the end and makes him realize that all of this is terrible, and it's a little heartfelt with them at the end. I guess I kind of liked that. I sort of liked that she's basically wearing the Sandman shirt the entire time, and I never picked up on that, didn't realize it was her. But that was the big thing that made me a little bit confused about the ages in this. So Peter Parker looks like he's 75 or 80 years old. Now that might just be because he led a hard life, and he's not actually as old as he looks, but the whole Sinister Six or Sinner Six, they all look not as old as Peter Parker does in this, but they are older than him because he's a teenager when he fights them as adults. Jameson does look like he's like 95 years old, so I mean, like, I do see the age difference there, but we also make a big deal out of how Jameson still sees him as a kid, so like we're dealing with that. We're making a big deal out of that. And with the Sinister Six, like, they don't look as old as they probably ought to, and I'm just not sure how much time actually passed. Like, we say that Mass have been outlawed, I think, for 10 years, but then there's also something about 30 years, and I don't remember what exactly the significance of that number was. Like, I thought at first that it was Mass have been outlawed for 30 years, but then there's something about 10 years we haven't had crime, so maybe it took 20 years to get rid of all the crime after that act was originally passed, or whatever. And so it is, if it's supposed to be an alternate 2006, like Watchmen's supposed to be an alternate 1985, then that means that all of this would have started in 76, 86, 96, 2006, yeah. And I don't know if that's what it's supposed to be. I don't know if this is set like slightly in the future, or if it's supposed to be ambiguous and we're just not even supposed to think about that. But I do find myself thinking about it because I'm not sure how old everybody's supposed to be. So, like, if Peter is only in his 60s, then, like, I don't know, he's got to be at least 65, and maybe he just, like, looks like he's 75, but he's only 60. Like, if you live a really hard life, that can happen. But even if he's only 60, that puts his whole rogues gallery at least 70, and a lot of those guys don't look that old to me in this. So I got really confused about the ages and stuff. Like I said, this book gets really, really sappy. A lot of the dialogue is just odd, and there are motifs that don't really pay off. Like, there's this whole nursery rhyme thing. We start with, you know, down the water spout, and, you know, Itsy Bitsy Spider, and there's this talk about, like, why we tell children nursery rhymes, and then later as things get darker, we talk about how nursery rhymes weren't originally meant for children. They were, like, warnings by adults about things. And, like, Humpty Dumpty is supposed to be Henry, what, the Fifth? Or I forget which Henry. And I don't know what the significance of all that is at the end of the day. I don't think it really ever pays off. I think ultimately there's too much internal monologue in this in general. I think it's a better book if you cut all of it out. And it reads like it's just there because it wants to be Dark Returns, and it had that kind of hard-boiled and noirish kind of thing, or even, like, you know, throwback to pulps, where it's like purple prose in internal monologue, and we're trying to do that with Spider-Man because, like, he's an old man now, and so he's gruffer, and he's more cynical, and he sees the world differently, so we think we can get away with that. And if he was the only internal monologue in the thing, where it was all more from his perspective, A, that might have worked better, and B, I might have gotten a better peg on him and just how crazy he's supposed to be, because we run away from him too often and then come back, and I have to keep kind of resetting. And we do a lot of internal monologue with a lot of other characters, and again, I think we do that because Dark Knight Returns does it, but it does it better, and it does it with fewer characters. I'm pretty sure we get in Carrie Kelly's head in Dark Knight Returns, and we jump back and forth between her and Batman, and I think maybe we do it with one or two other characters, but this does it with, like, everybody, and it's just too much, and it does it with characters that aren't really protagonists, and I'm not sure why I'm getting in their head. It just jumps around too much, and the POV keeps throwing me off about, you know, who I'm supposed to, like, really be paying attention to and rooting for, and I just would have cut out a lot of the internal monologue in this. I don't hate this book. I think it was an interesting experiment, but I think it is taking its cues too much from Dark Knight Returns. I think it was maybe a cool idea to start from that place, but actually really make it a dark Spider-Man story where Spider-Man himself doesn't have to be as dark as the rest of the piece. And I don't think, and I think it fails at that. I'm with Eric. It does end up reading cynical, and then at the end it's almost like it tacks on a happy ending, or it tacks on an ending that is kind of happy depending on whose side you're on and how you look at it. But I don't find myself, like, happier with or happier for Spider-Man at the end. Like, I don't find myself going, oh good, now he's taking responsibility and he's not going to commit suicide and he's going to move on and be proactive, because that guy could be dangerous. I just don't know how crazy he is. Anyway, if you've ever read this book, leave your comments, let me know what you thought of it. This was a very strange read. It's got some cool ideas. It made me think about some stuff. I think it's kind of self-serious. I think it's a little pretentious. I don't think that it's profound in the way it thinks it does, but I think it does have a couple of profound ideas that it doesn't really take as far as it should, and that don't end up working within the narrative as well as they do just on paper. So anyway, thanks again for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you again down the road for another Comic Vault. Captain Logan, and happy reading.